In the spring of 1987, Harlan County, Kentucky had not seen a drop of rain in 41 days. The soil cracked open like old leather left too long in the sun, white fissures running through fields that 3 generations of Cutter men had plowed, seeded, and harvested with their own bare hands. The county extension office put out a bulletin that April. It said that nearly 60% of small farming operations in the Eastern Basin had either defaulted on their loans or were operating within 90 days of insolvency. People read that bulletin at the feed store, at the diner, at the post office, and they nodded slowly the way people nod when a thing confirms what they already feared in their bones. Nobody read it more carefully than Elias Cutter. He stood at the window of his farmhouse that morning with the bulletin folded in his left hand and a cup of black coffee going cold in his right. He was 63 years old, though most people who didn't know him well would have guessed older. His face was the color of red clay after a long summer, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, with hands so rough and thick-veined that they looked carved from the same hardwood as the barn beams he'd replaced twice in 30 years. He was not a tall man. He was not a loud man. He wore the same canvas work jacket his father had worn, faded to a color somewhere between green and gray, and he moved through the world slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he has learned that haste costs more than it saves. His wife, Dorothy, had been gone 4 years. The cancer took her in November of 1983, which was also the year the East Field flooded and they lost the corn, which was also the year the First Savings Bank of Harlan sent him the first of what would become a long series of polite but firm letters. He kept those letters in a shoebox on the kitchen shelf. He had not answered all of them. Outside, his land spread in 3 directions, 82 acres total, though 20 of those were rocky hillside that had never produced much beyond wild blackberry and scrub oak. The remaining 62 acres were his life. The north field was tobacco, old-style burley, tended the way his grandfather had taught his father and his father had taught him, primed by hand, hung in the barn in long golden rows, cured slow. The south field was corn, dry land corn planted tight in rows that followed the natural contour of the land to hold whatever moisture might fall from a reluctant sky. And the east field, the big one, 40 acres of it, that was what everyone in the county talked about. That was what everyone was watching. That east field had been fallow for 2 years. The neighbors said Elias had lost his nerve. The men at the feed store said he'd given up after Dorothy died. Raymond Voss, who farmed the 300 acres adjoining Elias's land to the north, said plainly over coffee one Tuesday morning that old Elias Cutter was finished, that the bank would have those east 40 acres before the year was out, and that it would be a mercy, really, because some men just outlived their usefulness. Raymond Voss said a lot of things. He was 51 years old and had inherited his land from his father-in-law without ever having worked a bad season in his life. He drove a new pickup truck and sat on the county agricultural board and wore his opinions the way some men wear good boots, loudly, confident they'd hold up in any weather. Elias heard what Raymond said. Word travels in small counties the way water finds low ground, quietly, inevitably. He heard it and said nothing. He poured himself more coffee and looked out at his east field and said nothing at all. What nobody knew, what nobody had thought to ask, was why that east field was fallow. They assumed grief. They assumed defeat. They assumed that a 63-year-old widower with a shoebox full of bank letters and no sons to help him had simply run out of road. None of them were right. The truth started 30 years earlier, with Elias's father, a man named Harlan Cutter, who had farmed that same land since before the Elias had read every one. And then Elias had kept his own notebooks, in the same plain composition books his father had used, with the same careful handwriting, the same column and row layouts, the same patient attention to details that most farmers either didn't notice or didn't think worth recording. By 1987 he had 24 of his own to add to his father's 17. 41 notebooks covering nearly 5 decades of close observation of 82 acres of eastern Kentucky farmland. He knew things about that east field that could not be learned any other way. He knew, for instance, that the soil in the east field's lower quarter ran heavy with clay that stayed wet 2 weeks longer than the rest of the field after a rain, and that planting in that section before the second week of May in a wet year meant rotting seed and money lost. He knew that the field's north-facing slope lost its frost a full 10 days later than the south slope, and that the line where those 2 microclimates met, a diagonal running roughly from the old oak stump to the broken fence post on the eastern boundary, was where disease pressure always built first in a wet season. He knew that the east field's topsoil, which looked thin and poor to the eye, was underlain at 18 inches by a dark band of ancient loam that roots reached in August and that held fertility the way a dry sponge holds water, invisible until you pressed it. He knew one more thing. He had known it for almost 2 years. The east field was sick. Not dead. Not ruined. Sick in the way that land gets sick when it has been asked to produce the same crop in the same rotation for too many seasons without rest, a slow, cumulative sickness that shows up first as a slight yellowing in the young plants, then as a tendency toward disease, then as yields that drop 10% one year and 15% the next until a farmer is working twice as hard for half as much and he doesn't quite know why. Elias had watched it coming in his notebooks for 6 years. He had seen the corn yields in the east field slide from 140 bushels an acre to 112 to 97. He had seen the leaf blight come early 2 years running. He had tested the soil himself, using a kit he'd ordered from a university extension service, and what he found confirmed what the numbers already told him. The land needed time. Not fertilizer. Not a new seed variety. Not a bigger tractor or a consultant from the county office. Time. Rest. The specific rest of a field left fallow and managed carefully, cover cropped with crimson clover in winter rye to rebuild nitrogen, tilled once in autumn to break the pest cycles, left alone the second year to let the deeper biology recover. It was an old practice, older than any of the county agricultural board's recommendations. Harlan Cutter had done it twice in his farming life, both times to fields that had come back stronger than before. Elias had done the math. 2 years of lost income from the east 40 acres would hurt. Combined with Dorothy's medical bills and the low tobacco prices of the mid-80s and the loan payment to First Savings, it would hurt badly. But farming a sick field would cost him more, not in 2 years, but in 10, in 20, in the lifetime of the land he intended to leave behind him when he was gone. He thought about that land the way some men think about children. He thought about what he would be handing forward. So he left the east field fallow, and he endured the looks at the feed store, and he listened to Raymond Voss's opinions without responding to them, and he tightened his life down to its essentials: less propane, a kitchen garden for vegetables, the old pickup run another season on prayers and baling wire, and he waited. The second year of the fallow, Elias planted crimson clover in the east field in early September. He drove his old Ford tractor, a 1961 model that he and his father had rebuilt together in the barn over one long winter, which he had maintained with the same patience he gave the land, back and forth across the field in the early autumn light, the clover seed running through the old broadcaster he'd rigged to the 3-point hitch, the smell of turned earth rising around him in the cool air. He worked alone. He had always worked mostly alone, and he did not find it sorrowful. He found it clarifying. His neighbor to the south, a widow named Ida Pierce, watched from her fence line one afternoon as he made his slow passes across the empty-looking field. Ida was 71 and had farmed her own 30 acres since her husband Gerald passed, doing it herself until her knees gave out, then doing it with hired help she could barely afford. She was a small woman with white hair cut short and eyes that had seen enough of life to have stopped being surprised by most of it. "That east field," she called to him when he pulled near enough. Elias cut the engine and leaned on the steering wheel. "Miss Ida. What are you putting in?" "Clover." She was quiet a moment, looking at the field. "Resting it," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded slowly. Gerald rested the back field in 59. People thought he'd lost his mind. She paused. "Came back strong. Grew the best stand of tobacco we ever had in 61. She looked at Elias directly. "You know what you're doing." "Trying to," he said. She turned and walked back toward her house, and that was the end of it. Ida Pierce had a gift for economy. She wasted nothing, including words. The spring of 1988 was different. Not dramatically. The drought had eased, not ended, because droughts in eastern Kentucky didn't end so much as they relented, pulled back a few degrees, allowed a season of partial reprieve before they returned. There was rain in March, decent rain, a slow-soaking rain that came in 3 separate fronts over 2 weeks and got deep into the subsoil. The creek ran full for 10 days. The pastures greened up faster than they had in years. Elias walked his east field in the first week of April with his soil probe and his notebook. He worked methodically, corner to corner, taking samples at intervals he had mapped out on graph paper, pushing the probe 18 inches down, extracting cores, crumbling them between his fingers, smelling them, noting their color and texture and the presence of earthworms. He recorded everything. What he found was what he had hoped for and had not quite let himself believe in until now. The soil was alive in a way it had not been in years. The clover roots had worked through the clay layer, breaking it open, improving drainage. The worm count was up, he estimated it by the tunnel density in his cores, a technique his father had taught him and which no county extension bulletin had ever mentioned. The dark loam band at 18 inches was moister than it had been in 4 years. The old biology of the field, the fungal threads and the bacterial communities and the slow chemistry of decomposition had had 2 years to recover, and it had used the time well. Elias sat on the tailgate of his pickup at the edge of the east field that evening, the notebook open on his knee, and he did something he had not done in a long time. He allowed himself to feel something like hope. Not the reckless kind. The careful kind. The kind that a man earns through patience and that costs something to feel, because it means you're invested again, means you can be hurt again, means the land has you by the heart once more and you've chosen to let it. He had seed to plant. He'd spent the winter thinking through the variety selection with a care that most people reserved for choosing a spouse. He was going back to an older open-pollinated corn variety, not the high-yield hybrid that the seed company representative pushed every February at the Farm Bureau meeting, not the variety that required specific fertilizer inputs and produced spectacular yields in good years but collapsed badly in drought. He was planting a variety his father had grown, one that Harlan Cutter had maintained through 40 years of careful selection, saving the seed from the strongest plants at the end of every season, adapting it year by year to the specific conditions of that specific land. Elias had maintained the seed line for nearly 2 decades since his father's death, storing it in the root cellar in sealed glass jars, cold and dry, testing germination rates every spring, planting a small trial patch each season to keep the variety alive and acclimated. The seed company representative didn't sell this variety. It was not in any catalog. It existed in Elias Cutter's root cellar and nowhere else, because Elias Cutter's father had spent 40 years making it what it was. It was not the highest yielding corn in a perfect year. But in a hard year, in a drought year, in a year when the rains were unpredictable and the weather came sideways, it was steadier than anything the catalogs offered. Harlan Cutter's notebooks documented it across 15 seasons. Elias's own notebooks confirmed it across 20 more. He planted the east field on May 9, when the soil temperature at 4 inches had held above 55 degrees for 5 consecutive days, which his father's notebooks identified as the threshold for reliable germination in that particular field. He planted alone, running the old 4-row planter behind the Ford tractor, back and forth across 40 acres over 2 long days, the sky pale blue and cloudless, the smell of earth and diesel and old grease all around him. His back hurt by the end of the first day. He took 2 aspirin with his dinner and went to bed at 8 and rose at 5 and finished the planting before noon on the second day. He did not tell anyone what he had planted or why. May turned to June and June was dry. Not catastrophically dry, but dry enough that the new plantings on most farms in the county were struggling by the 3rd week. Raymond Voss's big hybrid corn was going in stressed, you could see it from the road, the lighter green that signals moisture deficiency, the slight curl at the leaf margins on the hotter afternoons. Raymond had irrigation capacity, a system he'd put in with borrowed money in 1985, but irrigation in a drought year means pump time and fuel costs and water table concerns, and even Raymond's bookkeeper was nervous. Elias's east field was different. The neighbors who drove past on County Road 12 noticed it first as a question more than a statement: why was old Cutter's corn greener than the fields on either side? Why did it not show the dry stress curl at 2 in the afternoon? Someone mentioned it at the feed store. Someone else drove out to look more carefully and came back saying the stand was uniform, thick, healthy looking in a way that didn't match the conditions. Raymond Voss drove by himself one Saturday morning and parked on the gravel shoulder and got out and stood at the fence for a long time. He didn't go in. He just looked. The corn was knee-high and it was right. There was no other word for it, it simply looked right, the deep blue-green color of a plant with access to moisture and nutrition, growing without the desperate vertical shoot that stressed corn puts on when it's racing to set seed before it dies. It was the color of a corn that didn't know it was supposed to be struggling. What Raymond couldn't see from the road, what nobody driving past could see, was what was happening underground. The roots of Elias's corn had found the dark loam band at 18 inches, the layer that the resting field had recharged with moisture over 2 winters. The root system of this particular variety, selected over decades for depth and lateral spread in variable moisture conditions, had gone down fast and wide, finding the water that the hybrid corn on surrounding farms, bred for quick above-ground biomass, had not reached. The clover root channels that had cracked open the clay layer gave those roots a road to follow downward. The crop was living on reserves that the fallow years had built. It was drawing on an account that Elias had spent 2 years depositing into. July brought heat. Real heat, the settling, suffocating kind that comes in from the southwest and parks over the hills for 2 weeks without moving. The county thermometer hit 94 degrees for 11 straight days in the second and third weeks of July. The creek dropped to a trickle. Ida Pierce's kitchen garden burned on the vine. Raymond Voss ran his irrigation from 6 in the morning until dusk, and his fuel bills would later make him feel faintly ill. Elias did not irrigate. He had no irrigation system. What he had was a corn crop that had already rooted deep enough that the top 6 inches of soil, the layer that was baking under the July sun, were almost irrelevant to it. He walked the east field every morning in the hour after dawn, before the heat came on, moving quietly between the rows, listening to the field in the way his father had taught him, looking at the underside of leaves and the color of the stalks and the way the tassels were forming and what the silk said about pollination progress. He carried his notebook. He was worried, but he was not panicking. Panic, Harlan Cotter had written in his third notebook, in 1948, is the enemy of good farming. Worry is the tool, panic is the trap. A worried farmer looks at the problem. A panicked farmer looks at himself. The heat broke on July 24 with an overnight thunderstorm that dropped 2.5 inches of rain across most of the county. Elias lay in bed and listened to it hit the tin roof of the farmhouse, the sound he had loved since childhood, the sound of debt retreating, of accounts being settled by the sky. In the morning he walked the east field again, and the soil between the rows was dark and the air smelled of minerals and growing things, and the corn had already responded, the way good deep-rooted corn responds to rain, not desperate, not startled, just steady, as though it had been waiting without anxiety and now resumed what it was doing. He wrote in his notebook, rain July 24, 2.5 inches. Crop in excellent condition. Ears setting well. Tassels finished. Silk gone brown on most plants, pollination complete. This one is going to come in. He closed the notebook and stood in the field for a moment with his hands at his sides, and he looked at the 40 acres of corn around him, and he thought about his father, and he thought about Dorothy, and he thought about the years of watching and recording and waiting, and he felt something move through his chest that was not quite any of the named emotions but was somewhere between gratitude and resolution. He drove to town that afternoon and called First Savings Bank from the pay. "Mr. Cutter," Curtis said, with the careful neutral tone of a man delivering difficult news to people regularly enough that he'd learned to soften the delivery without softening the content. "Mr. Briggs," Elias said. "I'm calling to tell you I'll be making a full payment on the outstanding balance in October. After harvest." A pause. "Mr. Cutter, the outstanding balance is—" "I know what it is," Elias said. "I'll have it." Another pause. Longer. That's a significant amount, Mr. Cutter." "Your recent payment history." "I know my payment history," Elias said. He was not unkind about it. "I'm telling you what's coming. You can note it in the file." He hung up. August was the cruelest month that year for most farmers in Harlan County. A second dry stretch came in, drier than the first, running through the last 3 weeks of August and carrying a heat that was different from July's heat, drier, more penetrating, the kind that takes the moisture out of the air and out of the soil surface and out of the corn leaves, the kind that causes late-season stress just when the kernels are filling, just when the plant needs everything it can get to put weight into the ear. 3 farms in the East Basin reported significant crop failures that August. One of them filed for bankruptcy protection before September. Raymond Voss's irrigated corn held on, but his yields would later come in at 91 bushels per acre, down from his projected 130, down from the 118 he'd averaged the past 3 years. He did not discuss this at the feed store. Elias walked his east field every morning through that August heat and watched the ears fill. His corn was not untouched by the stress. He could see it in the leaf roll on the hotter afternoons, in the slight tip back of the ears that indicated moisture competition. But the roots were deep, and the season's moisture account that the field had banked through the spring rains and the July storm was not yet overdrawn. The ears were filling. Not perfectly. Not the way they would fill in a year with adequate August rain. But filling. Elias checked his notes from drought years past. He checked his father's notes from 1953, from 1962, from 1967. He checked his own notes from 1980 and 1983. He looked at what this particular variety had done in those years, what it had produced under similar conditions, what the years had looked like at this stage of the season. He was not going to get 140 bushels per acre. He was not going to get 120. But his father's variety in a drought year, in a well-rested field with deep moisture reserves, had produced between 98 and 107 bushels per acre across 3 documented drought seasons in Harlan Cutter's notebooks. Elias calculated carefully, the way a man calculates when the numbers matter, not just to the story he tells himself, but to the bank, to the bills, to the continuation of everything he had spent his life building. 100 bushels per acre across 40 acres at market price would cover the outstanding loan payment and the coming year's operating costs, with enough margin to carry him through another season without the bank letters arriving in a different tone. He had to harvest it right. Weather was the wild card: an early frost, a late season storm, a week of rain that made the fields impassable at harvest time. These were the things that could not be accounted for, the variables that farming always held in reserve to remind a man that the land had its own intentions and patience was not the same as control. He watched the weather. He watched the corn. He slept lighter than usual in September, the way he always slept in September, with one part of his attention never quite leaving the fields. The first week of October was clear and cool, with the particular clarity of early autumn in the Kentucky hills. The sky is saturated blue, the air carrying the smell of curing tobacco and fallen leaves, the mornings cold enough to require a jacket but warming by 10 o'clock to something almost gentle. The corn was fully mature, the husks gone brown and papery, the stalks dry enough to rustle in the breeze like an old man's breathing. It was ready. Elias started harvesting on October 4th. He ran his old 2-row corn head on the Ford tractor, pulling the wagon behind. It was not a fast operation. The combine that Raymond Voss ran could do 40 acres in a day with 2 hands. Elias's setup would take him 3 days minimum, working from first light to last. His back would hurt. His hands would bleed from the husks when he climbed down to check plugs or clear wraps. He would be alone in the field from dawn to dusk with nothing but the machine sound and the corn sound and the sky overhead. He was not unhappy about this. He started in the southeast corner, where the field's south-facing slope and slightly sandier soil had let the crop mature a few days faster, and he worked his way in long runs across the width of the field, the corn coming into the gathering chains in long rushing rows, the ears stripped and shelled and the grain auguring up into the wagon in a continuous pale gold stream. He stopped twice in the first hour to walk to the wagon and look at the grain, its color, its moisture content as he bit into a kernel, the weight of it in his palm, and what he found made him stand quietly for a moment with the tractor idling behind him. The corn was right. After everything, after the drought, after the heat, after the 2 years of fallow and the long patience and the bank letters and the looks at the feed store, the grain in his hand was heavy and bright and right. He climbed back on the tractor and kept going. By noon of the second day, Ida Pierce appeared at the field's edge, walking along the fence row with a covered dish in her hands. He cut the engine when he saw her and climbed down stiffly, stretching his back. "Brought you lunch," she said. "You probably haven't stopped." "I was about to," he said, which was not entirely true. They sat on the tailgate of the pickup and Ida had brought chicken and biscuits and a mason jar of sweet tea, and they ate without much conversation, looking at the field, 2/3 harvested now, the cut rows opening up the view to the far fence, the standing corn in the remaining section still tall and dignified in the October light. "How's it coming in?" Ida asked. "Better than I hoped," Elias said. He paused. "Much better." Ida looked at the wagon, 3/4 full of grain. She had been around corn her whole life. She could read a wagon of grain the way some people read a face. She was quiet for a moment. "Calvin would be proud," she said. Elias didn't answer that right away. He looked at the grain in the wagon and thought about his father, about the notebooks in the wooden crate, about the 41 years of patient record-keeping that had made this harvest possible. "He did the work," Elias said finally. "I just kept the notes." He finished harvest on October 7th, in the late afternoon, the last rows going through the gathering chains as the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the field filled with long shadows. He cut the engine for the last time. He had his yield numbers from the wagon counts and the elevator tickets. He had hauled 2 loads to the elevator in town and had the weights. He did the final math sitting on the tractor in the October dusk. 108 bushels per acre. 40 acres. 4,320 bushels total, at a market price that had recovered slightly from its midsummer low. The number was enough. More than enough. He wrote it in his notebook in his careful handwriting and then sat for another moment in the cooling air. He drove to First Savings Bank on October 14th. He wore his one good shirt, which was a blue flannel with the collar button fastened. He carried a check drawn on his grain account for the full outstanding balance, the principal, the back interest, all of it. He had it in an envelope in his jacket pocket. Curtis Briggs met him at the window with the same careful neutral expression, though Elias noticed the young man's eyes went to the envelope and stayed there. Elias handed it over without ceremony. Curtis opened it and looked at the amount and was quiet for a moment. This covers everything outstanding," he said. "I know what it covers," Elias said. Curtis looked up at him. He was a young man, Elias thought, young in the way of someone who had learned the vocabulary of land and debt and hardship from books and spreadsheets and not from 40 years of walking fields before dawn. There was something in his face now that wasn't quite the same as his previous careful neutrality. It was something closer to respect, though the young man wasn't quite sure what he was respecting or why. "Mr. Cutter," he said. "How did you?" He stopped himself. It wasn't a professional question. Elias took the envelope back, the empty one, and folded it and put it in his pocket. "My father kept good notes," he said. He drove home in the old pickup through the October afternoon, past Raymond Voss's fields, past Ida Pierce's farmhouse where smoke was coming from the chimney, past the feed store where men had talked about him for 2 years, past the church where Dorothy was buried under a stone maple that would be turning color now. He drove past all of it with the windows down and the cool air coming in, smelling of harvest and wood smoke, and the word got around in the way things always get around in small counties. By the time November came, most people in the East Basin knew that Elias Cutter had put 108 bushels per acre off a 40-acre field that everyone thought was dead ground, in a drought year that had broken several other farms. They knew he'd paid off the bank. They knew he'd done it alone, with a 30-year-old tractor and seat his father had developed in 2 years of patient restoration work that everyone had mistaken for surrender. Raymond Voss said nothing about it publicly. He drove past the Cutter farm twice in November, and the second time he slowed down near the east field and looked at the harvested stubble for a long moment before driving on. At the feed store one afternoon in late November, a younger farmer named Danny Holt, 32 years old, second generation, struggling with a drought-hit place of his own, stopped Elias by the door and asked him, straight out, what he'd done with that east field. How he'd gotten those numbers in that year. Elias looked at the young man for a moment. "Come out to the farm sometime," he said. "I've got some notebooks you might want to look at." Danny Holt came out the following Saturday. He came at 7 in the morning and stayed until 4 in the afternoon, sitting at Calvin Cutter's kitchen table with 41 notebooks spread out around him, turning pages with a concentration that Elias recognized, the look of a man encountering knowledge that costs nothing and yet is somehow the most valuable thing he has ever been given. Elias made coffee and answered questions and told the young man what he knew, holding nothing back, the way his father had held nothing back with him. The knowledge was not a competitive advantage to be protected. The knowledge was the point. The knowledge was what the land deserved, someone paying close enough attention to understand it, someone caring enough to write it down, someone patient enough to act on it even when the whole county thought you'd lost your mind. When Danny Holt left that afternoon, he had 4 pages of notes in his own handwriting and the phone number of the University Extension Seed Library where Elias had once located an older corn variety for his father. He also had a small paper bag containing a half-pound of seed corn from Elias's root cellar, Calvin Cutter's variety, 40 years of careful selection in the hills of eastern Kentucky, adapted to exactly this kind of place and this kind of year. Danny Holt looked at the paper bag in his hands. Why are you giving this to me? Elias looked out at the east field, brown and bare under the November sky, resting now, banking its winter reserves, getting ready. Because the land doesn't care who owns it, he said. It just wants to be understood. He went inside and put the kettle on for another cup of coffee, and outside his farm sat quiet in the late autumn afternoon, the stubble fields, the old barn with the hay smell and the pigeon noise in the rafters, the faded tobacco shed, the root cellar full of glass jars and decades of patience, 82 acres of one man's whole life, which was also the continuation of his father's life and his father's father's life, which was also the beginning of something forward, something passed on. Something growing. The hills held the light a little longer on November evenings than most people noticed. Elias noticed. He had written it down page 3, his first notebook, October 1964, in handwriting that was younger and less certain than the handwriting he had now. Late light on the east field, it said. Land looks different when you pay attention. It did. It always had.